continuing the conversation about what Unitarian Universalism is going to be about.
Have you ever thought about what makes Unitarian Universalism unique?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is individual freedom of belief. Every member of UU can believe what they must. I think that makes UU unique.
Individual freedom of belief certainly is a fundamental part of what being in UU is about. But I was thinking of something else that I think makes UU unique.
Oh, I bet I know what's on your mind. The other thing that makes UU truly unique is that all decisions about this religion are in the hands of its members.
That's exactly what I was thinking about. Every voice matters in UU. That comes from our fourth and fifth principles.
Right. A free and responsible search for truth and meaning, plus the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process in our congregations. Together, they make UU unique.
Speaking of our principles, I assume you have heard that the Unitarian Universalist Association, the UUA, finished the review of Article 2 in the UUA bylaws. They have to do a review at least every 15 years.
Yes, I saw that the UUA is proposing a major rewrite of Article 2. The proposal got preliminary approval at General Assembly last June. A second vote is scheduled for GA in June of 2024.
I am a little overwhelmed by how much they want to change. It seems like everything they want to add makes me ask, what does this mean? Everything they delete makes me ask, why do they want to remove this?
I had the same reaction. This is a lot bigger change than I expected. The first thing we notice is that the principles would be replaced by values and covenant, and they would be a lot more verbose. There would be 3 times as many words.
The principles that make UU unique, the fourth and fifth, are kind of buried in there. It's like a game of where are my principles? The fourth principle is buried in the pluralism value. The fifth principle is buried under the justice value. And our first principle, which many members think is our most important principle, is now listed last. Will it still be obvious to potential members what makes UU unique? I can't imagine putting these value statements on a poster on the wall, if you know what I mean. They did the opposite with the sources. The current list of specific sources of inspiration would be replaced. It would not be a list anymore in the proposed rewrite. It's more general.
I see what you mean. I really like seeing the sources of my beliefs mentioned by name as specifically being welcome in the current version. Why would the UUA want to get rid of something that actually attracts lots of new members?
When I think back, the principles and sources were what drew me to UU. I liked the mix of spiritual and intellectual inspiration, along with the aspirations to work to make our world a better place.
It was the same for me. It feels like the rewrite would change the mix of what we focus on. I see less emphasis on personal spiritual and intellectual growth and more emphasis on collective action.
The UUA wouldn't be proposing such a major change if it wasn't intended to have a major impact on all of UU. But what is the goal of all of these changes? The Article 2 Study Commission wants to change a lot more than just the principles and sources. For instance, they want to change the purpose of the UUA, so it no longer says that their primary purpose is to serve the needs of its member congregations. Why are they doing that?
I don't know. It looks intentional. It seems like this will change the distribution of power in UU, but it is hard to see what the intention really is. I am also wondering why they are removing the explicit protection against infringement upon individual freedom of belief, leaving only a vague reference to our UU heritage.
Merely referring to our heritage, our past, is not the same thing as a firm commitment, going forward. And it does not even mention individual freedom of belief as being central to our heritage. This does not just seem like poor writing, the vagueness seems intentional. But what is the intention behind abandoning individual freedom of belief?
You make a good point about the intentional vagueness of referring to UU's heritage. An individual's right of conscience is in the fifth principle, but in the rewrite is only something UU affirmed in the past. Congregational freedom is also explicitly confirmed in the current principles, but not in the rewrite. It concerns me that they are removing the firm commitment to both of those foundational principles in the rewrite.
And why add a caveat in the inclusion section, saying we welcome all persons who share our values? The section name is inclusion, not exclusion. This seems like a deliberate rejection of the liberal value of tolerance.
Obviously, there are actions that are not welcome. Tolerance never meant anything goes. But adding a caveat like this could have unintended consequences. This statement, as written, could be used to exclude persons who we disagree with. Kicking people out because we disagree is not what UU is about.
That reminds me of something our new UUA president said at a workshop at General Assembly in 2022. She said, "We have to be willing to say no in UU spaces, willing to say to each other, you are out of covenant right now. You are so out of covenant, you cannot be back in this community until you're willing to do the work of repair. You cannot break this community, over and over again, out of your, whatever it is, trauma, fear, anger, loss, despair. I mean, those are pastoral issues. You can always come home, but you got to come correct. That's a covenant. I'm sorry, but this is not what I would call beloved community. This is an outright rejection of tolerance of alternative points of view." Our new UUA president's approach to covenant makes me really concerned about that caveat in the inclusion section, where it says we welcome all persons who share our values. That also makes me concerned about adding a whole bunch of new covenants. Every value will have its own covenant. It seems like they are trying to dictate what our priorities will be.
This just feels so heavy-handed. This feels so paternalistic. The current principles are aspirational. Inserting new covenants into each value statement turns the aspirations into dictates. Dictates turn aspirations into tests we have to pass. I don't think dictates are the right way to build a beloved community.
There is also a new overall covenant that is worded very differently. Will our congregations now have direct covenants with the UUA? That would also redistribute power in UU. It is not clear to me what the intention is.
Me either. And what about the accountability statement they want to add? Who would we be accountable to? What would the consequences be if someone decides that we are not doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love? What is a spiritual discipline of love anyway?
Sometimes I think I need a secret decoder ring. A lot of the new words and phrases in the Article 2 rewrite are kind of ambiguous. How can we be accountable for values that have lots of different ways to interpret them?
I have the same concerns. How do we define racism? Is it unequal opportunities or unequal outcomes? There's a big difference between those definitions of racism. I think equal outcomes is just an impossible thing to achieve. If dismantling racism implies a goal of equal outcomes, this would be an unrealistic commitment we are being asked to make.
And what does the word dismantle mean? Dismantle is an aggressive word. Using words like dismantle and systemic and oppression makes me think this is really about critical race theory. I am reminded that our new UUA president gave a sermon where she said that UU needs to be in dialogue with the teachings of critical race theory. One of the members of the Commission on Institutional Change explained that the Widening the Circle of Concern report is based on critical race theory. Isn't the whole agenda of dismantling white supremacy culture in UU really based on critical race theory? It seems to me that dismantling white supremacy culture is the same as dismantling racism and all forms of systemic oppression. They mean the same thing. And isn't dismantling all forms of systemic oppression actually a call to abandon the Western, liberal, Enlightenment values that UU is based on? Values like reason and tolerance of multiple points of view and due process and even democracy itself. This is essentially a rejection of liberalism. This really concerns me.
It is interesting that you mentioned democracy as being one of the liberal values that could be abandoned. In the very next sentence in the justice value, I noticed that they are adding the word inclusive in front of democratic processes. I remember watching a recording of a workshop presented at General Assembly in 2020. It was about inclusive democracy. Based on that workshop, I am concerned that inclusive democratic processes are not actually liberal democracy as we think of it.
Moving on to other ambiguous phrases in the new values. What does it mean to covenant to freely share our resources and money? Will we be out of covenant if our annual donation is not big enough? Will the congregation be out of covenant if our congregation does not contribute as much as the UUA demands? I can see why you said this just feels so heavy-handed.
And why is it necessary to say that we covenant to learn from one another? Does this place limits on our search for truth? And does insider jargon like beloved community belong in the bylaws? No one outside UU will know what that means. Every UU member probably has their own ideas about what beloved community means. The word is too ambiguous. And what does it mean to covenant, to collectively transform? This sounds like change for the sake of change. Would we be out of covenant if we oppose a change that the UUA proposes? Not all change is automatically good. And is individual flourishing something we would call a right, or just something we hope for but can't be guaranteed? And what does it mean to work to repair harm and damaged relationships of the earth and all beings? That can mean almost anything. How can we responsibly commit to such an open-ended mandate? Remember, goals like these will not just be aspirations anymore.
Wow, that's a lot to think about. Don't forget what's missing. Principle number 6 is not carried forward in the rewrite. UU has had a goal of world community all along, since the merger in 1961. And now we are going to just get rid of it? Why? I am also reminded of another new purpose, to heal historic injustices. That sounds like a mandate for reparations, of some sort. And don't overlook the new paragraph in the purposes section. The transformation of the world through liberating love. What does that even mean? That sounds so presumptuous, even patronizing, in a way. Apparently, liberating love doesn't include a goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. What kind of transformation do they have in mind? This is not adding up for me. Every one of these new values has words we don't really understand, yet we are entering into a covenant to commit to be accountable for them.
We are not just being picky about words. The words matter. Our new UUA president said at General Assembly in 2022 that covenant without consequences is not actually covenant.
Covenants with consequences are dictates. We need to know who will be judging our actions. What matters is how the enforcers of accountability define the new words.
Well, I think having UUs judging other UUs is a bad idea, particularly if we don't even agree on what specific words and phrases mean. That could be very divisive.
Goodness gracious, we shouldn't do things that could be more divisive. Our membership has dropped 4 years in a row.
Yes, we need to consider how this rewrite might affect membership. Does it make UU more attractive or less attractive? I've got another viewpoint about the Article 2 rewrite I want to offer. At General Assembly last June, an amendment to the Article 2 rewrite was proposed that would add gratitude as another value. I appreciated the intent. The amendment suggested that we needed some joy in our values. But the Article 2 Study Commission opposed adding gratitude as a value. Their reasoning really got me to look at the whole rewrite in a different way. The Commission representative said that if we are truly grateful, we will show that in our generosity. If we are grateful, according to the dictate in the new generosity value, we will freely and compassionately share our faith, presence, and resources. Otherwise, according to the Commission, being grateful is just an exercise in gross individualism. This is one of the more explicit attacks on us as individuals that we have heard. This is something I think we need to consider. Is limiting the autonomy of the individual members of UU one of the major themes of the Article 2 rewrite? Now I am thinking that we should be paying closer attention to all of the new words added to the values that emphasize the collective over the individual. I'm also seeing that the extra covenants are partly an attempt to restrict our autonomy as individuals. I see the same theme in the accountability statement. I think that statement is clearly an attempt to limit our individual prerogatives as members of UU. I think this theme partly explains why a caveat that justifies excluding people was added to the inclusion section. It seems like the removal of the commitment to individual freedom of belief is a direct dismantling of the freedoms of the individual. I do think I see a theme here, emphasizing the collective at the expense of the individual. And if you still aren't convinced that a major goal of the UUA is to de-emphasize the individual, I will remind you of what the Commission recommended in their first proposal, back in October of 2022. After spending 2 years thinking about this, their first proposal chose to leave out the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. That is a direct erasure of individual freedoms in UU. Their first proposal also chose to leave out the democratic process. The UUA apparently didn't want any commitment to democracy in UU anymore. These were astounding choices. The fourth and fifth principles have been part of UU since the merger in 1961. There was apparently a lot of pushback, so the Commission spliced both of them back in. But the point is that this is a clear indication that the goal of the UUA is to emphasize the collective at the expense of the individual.
As I said earlier, the UUA wouldn't be proposing such a major change if it wasn't intended to have a major impact on all of UU. What's the big picture here?
It sure is confusing. We are told that UU needs a major transformation. But we are also assured that the UUA can't tell congregations what to do. These changes seem to be incompatible with congregational freedom.
I just realized something. We just got through reviewing all of the ways that the Article 2 rewrite is emphasizing the collective at the expense of the individual. But we need to focus a little more on the first word. The collective. The missing piece to the puzzle is right in plain sight. What we missed is the emphasis of the collective at the expense of the individual congregation. At the expense of congregational freedom.
Right in plain sight. The new overall covenant. A covenant congregation to congregation and through our association. I see it now. The question is not, will the UUA start telling congregations what to do? It was premature to fill in the blank. The question is, will congregations be told what to do by some governing body? And will congregations be told what their priorities are by some governing body?
When you explain it that way, I get a new understanding of one of the frequently asked questions the Article 2 Study Commission answered on their website. The question was, what do you mean by, we are accountable to one another? The answer was, in part, that the UUA Board of Trustees, the Article 2 Study Commission, and the UUA administration cannot impose covenants and commitments, or tell congregations or individuals what to do. My first reaction was, well, sure, not yet. Article 2 doesn't control that. The relationship between the congregations and the UUA is defined in a different place in the bylaws, in Article 3. Article 3 won't be rewritten until 2025 or 2026. But the very last line in the FAQ said, congregations, through their delegates, vote on what values they share and what they can agree to do together. That bears repeating. What they can agree to do together.
So I guess that's what's going to change. Right now the congregations make their own decisions about what to do. It looks like the vision of the Commission is that in the future, delegates to General Assembly would come to some agreement about what the agenda for all of UU would be. Then, to be accountable and to be in alignment with the new congregation-level covenants, the congregations would be obligated to do what was agreed to at General Assembly.
The congregations would no longer be autonomous, free to decide for themselves what their priorities are.
That's the piece we missed. We have two themes: limiting the autonomy of individual members and weakening the freedom of individual congregations to do as they see fit.
Maybe we shouldn't be so surprised. The Widening the Circle of Concern report had a lot of criticisms of congregational polity in UU. Polity is a word that means governance, or how we are governed. First of all, the instructions to the Commission on Institutional Change specifically wanted to have the distribution of power analyzed. Then, over and over again, congregational polity was identified as a big problem. Let me read just a couple lines. We need a congregational polity that serves us, rather than blocks progress. And it says congregations lack a covenantal understanding with one another and with the association. Then, congregations may not see a duty toward the association as a whole, especially when the association is acting as a change agent. The report seems to clearly be recommending a centralization of power and at the expense of congregational freedom and autonomy.
The autonomy of individuals is also strongly criticized in the Widening report. Over and over, it talks about there being too much emphasis on the individual in UU. I also think this is a telling statement. The report says covenant and commitment, not comfort, should be the binding fabrics of UU congregations and other communities. This seems to clearly be emphasizing the collective at the expense of the individual.
In the big picture, where is the Article 2 rewrite taking UU? It seems like the goal is to transform UU from a liberal religion into a kind of an activism organization.
Believe it or not, to answer that question, we need to talk about love. So let's talk about love. Everybody loves love. The rewrite says love is at the center of our shared values. But love has dozens of definitions. The question is this just a feel-good platitude, or is this a specific kind of love being centered?
I think I know where you are going with this. I am remembering the instructions the UUA board gave to the Commission, which said that our commitment to personal, institutional, and cultural change rooted in anti-oppression, anti-racism, and multiculturalism values and practices is love in action.
Yes, that is where I was headed. I think that makes it clear that UU will be centered on social justice activism if this rewrite is approved. Let's review some of the changes that seem to be intended to make UU place its main focus on social justice. We see a potential centralization of power in UU. We see the UUA accumulating more power because they no longer include the current primary purpose of the UUA, which is to serve the needs of its member congregations. As one of the co-chairs of the Article 2 Study Commission said at General Assembly, the Commission took care with every word they used. We should assume every new word was added for a reason, and every deleted word was deleted for a reason. We have to assume there is a reason they want to remove this line. In addition, we see General Assembly having more power because of the new overall covenant, like we just talked about. It also is very possible that the new accountability statement results in the UUA playing a big role in enforcement of congregational accountability. Who else could be handed the responsibility for applying consequences for congregations being out of covenant if it is not handed to the UUA to oversee and administer? The UUA seems to think that centralizing power in UU is a prerequisite for getting all of UU to focus on the same things at the same time. But that is not true. Congregations can always agree to act on good ideas. But we need a way to push back on bad ideas.
I agree. Congregations should hold on to their power. We also can see the potential control of individual priorities, resulting from that same accountability statement. All of the new covenants, one in each value, will dictate our personal priorities. The abandonment of individual freedom of belief means individuals do not control their own priorities. The justification added to the inclusion section, to exclude persons who are judged as not sharing our values, makes sure everyone has the same priorities. The implication that congregational freedom and the individual's right of conscience are just relics of UU's past removes some barriers to central control of priorities of both individuals and congregations. And remember, we also concluded that adding the word inclusive in front of democratic processes actually means this is not supporting democracy in UU, as we understand it. All of these changes could lead to us losing control over our own individual priorities, as well as our congregation's priorities.
Of course, we see the centering of a social justice agenda in the justice value, where we covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of systemic oppression. But we also see a social justice agenda in a new primary purpose to heal historic injustices. The interdependence values focus on repairing harm and damaged relationships, also make social justice a high priority. So does the new overall purpose, which is the transformation of the world through liberating love. And we especially see a focus on a social justice agenda in that specific definition of love in action we saw in the charge. Tying it all together is the new graphic of UU's values, where the Commission highlights love as the central value of UU.
You know, this emphasis on love is what lots of people like the best about the rewrite. As you said before, everybody loves love. But I honestly think this is the most misinterpreted part of the proposal. That worries me. Some people might be supporting the rewrite due to a misunderstanding. Here, in this proposal, the UUA is talking about a specific kind of love. To really emphasize their point, the charge from the Board of Trustees to the Article 2 Commission repeated their definition of love. The board clearly intended that this love in the center of this graphic represents our commitment to anti-racism, anti-oppression, and multiculturalism. This love is not about personal relationships. This love is not about what binds us to our Unitarian Universalist community. This love is about social justice action.
Now let me summarize what we just talked about. All of these changes seem to be intended to make sure everyone is aligned and strongly focused on the same social justice agenda. The centralization of power, the control over priorities, and the multi-pronged emphasis on social justice would transform UU into a kind of a social justice activism organization.
If that happens, I don't think UU would be a liberal religion anymore. Is that the transformation UU members want? We need to have some hard conversations about this.
Right before General Assembly last June, the UUA Board of Trustees urged the delegates to preliminarily approve the Article 2 proposal, so we can continue the conversation. We are expected to study it for a year, and then have a final vote at General Assembly in June of 2024. It only took 50% to get preliminary approval, but it needs 67% to be approved for final adoption.
Some of us have a lot of questions we need answers to before that vote at General Assembly in June. So, let's have those conversations.
As was just mentioned, the National Unitarian Universalist Association has proposed a major rewrite of our principles and sources in Article 2 of the UUA bylaws. At General Assembly last June, they gained approval to forward an amended proposal to the congregations. The delegates forwarded it to us to continue the conversation about whether to approve this rewrite when the final vote is taken at General Assembly in June.
Now is the time for us to step up to the plate. Everyone is encouraged to help evaluate this proposal.
The democratic process is not just about voting. It's about analyzing different points of view to make an informed decision.
Our job is to anticipate how each word and phrase will affect UU, then decide whether this transformation is wise and prudent.
Our congregation's job is to help each of us help make this decision.
By making sure we have ample opportunities to be exposed to all points of view. We want to give you a little more background on the amendment process Article 2 went through at General Assembly last June.
It was clear that some delegates at General Assembly had the same concerns some of us do.
But it was also clear that the Article 2 Commission is really confident that this transformation is what UU needs.
UU delegates have a history of going along with what the UUA recommends.
That was the pattern when delegates voted on proposed amendments to the Article 2 proposal at General Assembly.
If the Commission spoke against an amendment, it was decisively rejected. If the Commission was silent, the amendment passed.
We're going to show you a graph of this. We think it shows the influence the Commission had on the voting is very clear. If the Article 2 Commission did not speak against an amendment, the delegates voted decisively in favor of the amendment. But if the Commission spoke against an amendment, the delegates voted no by a large margin. Most of the amendments that were rejected were aimed at fixing some of the issues we are concerned about. But the Commission did not want those issues fixed.
An amendment to add a new section to keep a list of the historic principles was opposed by the Commission. And sure enough, 73.6% of the delegates voted against keeping a list of the current principles in the bylaws. An amendment to put the list of 6 sources of inspiration back into Article 2 was opposed by the Commission and only got 11.3% yes votes. An amendment to restore a firm commitment to individual freedom of belief was opposed by the Commission. A co-chair of the Commission spoke against an amendment to fix the accountability statement, and it was rejected. An amendment to bring back the wording of the first principle to affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person was opposed by the Commission. An amendment to replace the caveat, who share our values, in the inclusion section, which appears to limit who we truly welcome, was opposed by the Commission. An amendment that would remove the dictate to repair harm and damaged relationships in the interdependence value was not opposed by the Commission, and so it passed, with 78.4% voting yes. Okay, wait a minute. This actually fixed one of the ambiguous phrases that we had been very concerned about. And the Commission did not intercede. And it passed. But a few minutes ago when we showed the proposed values, this phrase was in there. What gives? We think this is important enough to spend a minute on. Here is how the proposed interdependence value was worded before General Assembly. Here is the amendment to the interdependence value that was proposed and voted on. Here is how the UUA showed what was inserted in the green font and what was deleted in the red font with the strike-through line. Note that the amendment deleted the entire last line. In October of 2023, the Article 2 Commission revealed their final revision, which incorporated all of the amendments that had passed at General Assembly in June. Almost every amendment was incorporated exactly the way the amendment had been worded, except for the amendment to interdependence. Here was the way the UUA had said it would look, showing what was inserted in green and what was going to be deleted in red if the amendment passed. So it did pass with 78% of the vote. But here is how the Article 2 Commission chose to incorporate the amendment. Basically, they kept the new words the amendment inserted. Those are the words in green near the bottom. But, and this is very unexpected, they did not remove the words that the amendment had deleted. They kept almost all of their original words. Those are the words in purple. Most importantly, they reinserted the line that says we will work to repair harm and damaged relationships. That is the one that we are concerned about because it could mean almost anything. Remember, these are covenants we are agreeing to. These are not aspirations anymore. It is obvious that those words are very important. Otherwise, the Commission would not have ignored the will of the delegates and added back in the words that the General Assembly delegates had approved being deleted. We need to know more about what goals the UUA has that make those words so important. And we need to take note that this might be what an inclusive democratic process looks like. If the UUA disagrees with the delegate decision, the vote of the delegates doesn't count. That is not democracy as we know it.
I want to show you this graph one more time. The red bars are the amendments the Commission spoke against. The green bars are the ones the Commission did not oppose. The delegates did not vote against the Commission on any amendment. The point is that the UUA actively resisted attempts to fix some of our major concerns. Our choice is very simple. Yes or no to the whole rewrite.
I have a question. Why does the Article 2 rewrite matter to us? What the UUA does never seems to affect what we do in our congregation. If we don't like what they say, we can just ignore them.
We hear that a lot. What happens in Boston stays in Boston, right?
That's the whole point. What happens in Boston stays in Boston. The UUA thinks that's the problem. Solving that problem is the UUA's goal.
What happened in Pittsburgh stayed in Pittsburgh. What happened in Portland stayed in Portland. The UUA wants to see follow-through.
Things like actions of immediate witness pass at General Assembly, but that doesn't mean the congregations make those AIWs their top priorities.
Some AIWs promote controversial actions like defunding the police in 2020, or abolishing ICE in 2018, or asking congregations to stop calling the police in 2020.
Wow, I didn't know about any of those action of immediate witness initiatives. And, frankly, all of that seems so far removed from what I get out of being in UU.
Which is precisely the point. AIWs are not binding. Congregations can ignore them if they have different priorities. This is very frustrating to the activists in UU. Defunding the police was part of an AIW that got an 82% vote of approval in 2020 and then was part of an AIW in 2021 that got 99% approval. 99%. A call to abolish the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Department got 90% approval in 2018 and was part of an AIW again in 2020. The AIW in 2020 also called for congregations to choose not to involve police departments and deactivating security systems that mobilize police response when triggered. Again, that was approved by 82% of delegates. The fact that many UU members never heard about any of this is precisely the point. This frustration is maybe epitomized by an AIW from back in 2015. An AIW supporting the Black Lives Matter movement included a call for prison abolition. After a very contentious debate, that call was expanded a little to clarify that it was a call to replace the current prison system with a system that is more just and equitable. After such an emotional debate, it was very frustrating that what happened in Portland in 2015 stayed in Portland. The activist energy at GA did not have much carryover into the congregations after GA.
Centralized control can simply mean that if 2/3 of the delegates to GA approve something, every congregation has to make it a priority.
Of course, the missing piece to the puzzle is how to hold congregations accountable for following through on initiatives like these in the future.
The only thing that makes sense is if the UUA itself is assigned the responsibility for enforcing the new overall covenants.
All we can do at this point is make an educated guess about how accountability would work if Article 2 is approved. What we do know is that the charge to the bylaws renewal team references 3 studies that recommended significant changes in UU's governance structure. The charge highlights calls to make significant changes to the role of covenant in UU governance. Since covenant has little or no role in UU governance right now, this seems to be a clue that the new covenants in Article 2 are a really big deal. We also want to point out that the bylaws renewal team charge specifically asks for the rest of the bylaws to provide accountability for our anti-racist and anti-oppressive commitments. Some kind of accountability enforcement mechanism is probably going to be added. We just don't know what.
I hate conflict. Saying no is hard. The pressure to go along, to get along, is intense. Some people really want this. If we say no, won't that make things worse?
We hear you. We aren't going to sugarcoat this. Standing up for what you believe is sometimes hard. But at the same time, we are caretakers of this religion.
We hope to hear every voice. Try to resist just deferring to what other people think. Every voice matters. That's what makes you unique.
At General Assembly last June, the Commission was very clear. That preliminary vote was not to adopt the new Article 2, but rather to continue to study it. Our leaders fully recognized that in our congregation some of these conversations are hard. But delegate after delegate had the same message. They were voting yes to keep the conversation going. We need to continue to discuss the proposed change to the purpose of the UUA, which removes the primary purpose of serving the needs of its member congregations. Should the UUA play a different role in Unitarian Universalism? We need to discuss what would happen if the explicit protection against infringing on individual freedom of belief is removed. In fact, we need to discuss the whole theme of the dismantling of the freedoms of the individual, putting greater emphasis on the collective. We need to study what the impact of dictates implied by the new covenants would be. Are dictates, are adding tests we have to pass, the way to build beloved community? We need to continue the discussion about how accountability would work. This is intended to be real accountability. Who would we be accountable to? By what criteria will we be judged? What are the consequences of being judged to not be doing the work of living our shared values? We need to discuss whether we want to add verbose value statements to replace the concise principles. We need to discuss whether we want to drop the list of specific sources of inspiration. We need to work on getting clear definitions of the many new ambiguous words and phrases. We should not commit to being accountable for words and phrases we don't all define the same way. The delegates said that, overall, it's worth giving it another year of discussion. So, let's have those discussions about these questions, and more. We need to look at the big picture with regard to the proposed rewrite of Article 2. If the current principles get buried in the new verbose values statements, will people still easily see what makes you unique? Will people still feel included if the specific sources of inspiration are no longer listed? Are more covenants and accountability going to attract more people, or possibly repel people? Is prioritizing the collective over the individual liable to attract or repel people? Will the overall purpose of the transformation of the world through liberating love generate applause, or puzzlement, or perhaps outright alarm about our intentions? In other words, will UU still be attractive to existing members as well as to potential members? With membership declining for 4 straight years, this is an important consideration. Will UU still practice tolerance of a broad diversity of points of view? Will UU still be seen as prioritizing the freedoms of us as individuals? Will UU still try to build consensus based on reason and persuasion? Will UU still be committed to true democratic processes, not just voting? In other words, will UU still be a liberal religion? If the new covenants imply consequences, and accountability implies consequences, is this compatible with congregational autonomy? In other words, will congregations still set their own priorities after the new covenants and accountability are in place? And, finally, is this the transformation UU members want? Do we want UUs judging other UUs, even though that could be very divisive? Do we want to strongly emphasize the collective at the expense of individual autonomy? Do we want to centralize power in UU, to emphasize the collective over the individual congregations? Do we want UU to become a kind of a social justice activism organization with the agenda set for everybody by some governing body? I repeat, is this the transformation UU members want?
We know these are hard choices. One thing to realize is that it is perfectly acceptable to vote against this Article 2 rewrite. The last time changes were proposed in 2009, they were voted down. That proposal did not even get 50% on the first ballot in 2009.
You can tell the UUA no to this rewrite. Tell them you want to continue the conversation after this vote. They can try again in a couple years. The last major change back in 1985 went through many iterations. It took about 7 years before they got it right.
In that 1985 revision, all of the extra time to develop consensus paid off. In the final vote, there was only one no vote.
Or maybe a big rewrite is not what is needed. In a couple of years, perhaps a couple of simple amendments could be proposed.
If everybody loves love, something saying that could be added. If we need a specific affirmation of anti-racism, that can be a separate amendment.
Whatever we do, we need to clearly understand what we are agreeing to. We are deciding the future of UU. We need to get this right.
Now it's our turn. Deciding what UU is going to be about is in our hands. It's a huge responsibility. Now is the time to continue the conversation. We want the next generation that is looking for a liberal religion to recognize UU as serving that role in our society. We want the next generation of seekers of truth and meaning to be able to find us. If you are looking for more information about the issues we just explored, visit the website savethe7principles.org. Let's be wise and prudent caretakers of this religion.